which has been broadened to include topics on beef, lamb and goats. It's great to have you here today. My name is Courtney Cheers and I work with the webinar coordinators Holmes Sackett. The webinar series comprises of a total of 30 webinars that will be presented between now and July 2020. These webinars are recorded and can be accessed at a later date on the MLA website. Otherwise, if you're in contact with me, I can provide it to you sooner. The title of today's webinar is Production and Financial Performance in Rangeland Goat Herds. John Francis of Holmes Sackett will be discussing the early stage findings from the MLA goat benchmarking project for rangeland goat meat producers. For those who aren't familiar with the webinar platform, I'll just run you through the housekeeping of the platform. The control panel you can see to your right is able to be opened and closed using the red arrow, so you can enjoy the full screen view during the presentation. You should be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. So I would encourage you to use the chat box in the control panel to communicate any questions that you have during the presentation. Just please make sure that your questions are as clear as you can write them so that they can be addressed with relevant responses. When you log out of the webinar, a survey will pop up for you to fill out. I'd encourage you all to fill this out because it allows us to improve webinars and the extension efforts to make sure that we're targeting topics that are relevant to you. I'd like to kick the webinar off for today and introduce John Francis, who is a director at Holmes Sackett. John, are you ready for me to make you a presenter?
Yep, that's fine. Courtney? Great. So I think we're just waiting for that screen, and once that's up, I will get into it. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present today. Just by way of background, I guess it's important for me just to introduce how we got to this point. MLA have funded a goat benchmarking project. We are the recipients of that funding, and we are working with MLA to benchmark goat businesses from across from across Australia actually, and the intention is to collect data from goat enterprises such that we have some information about the production performance and the financial performance. Now, the data collection isn't unique to Rangeland's businesses, but it does happen to have fallen that way. That is, the weight of the majority of data that we've collected so far is actually from the rangelands. And when I'm talking rangelands, I'm really talking sort of less than 500 millimetre rainfall zone. And typically those enterprises are made up of breeding herds, probably behind wire, opportunistically harvested goat herds, as well as trading herds. Okay, so the intention today of this webinar is really to talk about the project and the background of the project. I'm going to talk about how we measure farm business management. I'm going to talk a little bit about what benchmarking is. Then I'll go on to talk to the Rangeland's goat performance. Features of what we've done is taken out those businesses that are high profit goat producers, and effectively we've differentiated those or looked at those businesses slightly differently to the remainder and tried to establish what it is about those businesses that actually leads to higher levels of performance. And the final comment there is we still want you, and what that's all about is we are still accepting benchmarking participants. So if you are at all interested, we are interested in speaking to you. And I noticed there's a question already, how many businesses are we benchmarking? Thanks for the question, David. Look, the aim is to have as many as possible, but at the moment we've got 54 data points. Well, actually, I think that's 57 data points over the 3 years, and that 3-year period runs from the 15-16 financial year to the 2018 financial year. The intention is that we will take it for another 2 years, so we will have 5 years worth of data. Okay. So I just thought I'd start with a slide about measuring business, livestock and business management. And I think the analogy I like to use about assessing farm business performance is the dashboard of your vehicle. On your vehicle, each dial is an indicator of a different aspect of car and driver performance. And I guess that's no different to some extent to what you see in benchmarking when you're benchmarking a farm business. And when I talk benchmarking, I'm really just talking about running a set of management accounts over the business. And management accounts differ to compliance accounts in that they measure the true operational performance of the business. The true operational performance is slightly different to the compliance performance because basically when you're doing your compliance figures, you're really reporting for the government. And there's a lot of the reporting mechanisms that you use that aren't necessarily truly reflective of operating performance of your business. So some of those indicators are linked to each other and some are standalone indicators when you're looking at your dashboard. So for example, the speedometer is a gauge of speed at any point in time, but that information feeds into the trip computer, which gives you average speed over the trip and accumulated distance travelled over a trip. And those dashboard gauges are used to monitor both your car performance and your driver performance and efficiency. So some of those gauges are designed to provide you with a warning so that you can change something before you do some damage. But the important point I want to make here is that the gauges don't actually change your car performance. They just indicate how you're travelling. For car performance to improve, the driver's actually got to interpret the information that's delivered by those instruments and then make a decision on what to change and how to implement that change. That is no different to farm business management reporting or farm benchmarking. So what the benchmarking output actually reports is the performance of the business, and there's a number of key performance indicators, and each one of those key performance indicators is a measure of either your production efficiency or production measures of your business or your financial performance and financial measurements. But the important part is it just delivers a report. It doesn't actually it doesn't change anything within your business. The changes within your business are up to you as a result of receiving that information. So just as you change something as a result of seeing the dials on your dashboard, the intention is that we report the business efficiency of your business, and then you can change something on the basis of delivery of that information. So if you're driving without gauges, how are you going? Well, I would challenge any of you to drive really efficiently for any level of distance without your gauges and establish how you're actually going to get there in an efficient way. And that, I think that's exactly the same in your farm business. To drive your farm business as efficiently as possible, you need the dashboard, you need the indicators, you need the measures so that you can actually take off the blindfold and go as efficiently as possible. Now you have to make the changes, but at least you'll have the information to provide you with the ability to make those changes or identify what needs to change for improvements in efficiency. So that's sort of the benchmarking report. So it's really just an accumulation of some key performance indicators about production and financial measures, and it's a report of financial performance as well. But that is not what benchmarking is. Benchmarking takes it to the next step. And what I've used here is some footy examples or an analogy of football players to show just how benchmarking works. And so all benchmarking is, another word for benchmarking is a comparison. And the idea of the comparison is to identify where you sit relative to a known cohort of others. And in this case, on the slide, I've got some AFL players. And if you go onto the AFL website, basically you can benchmark just about anything that any two players do. So you can actually compare one player against another or one player against multiple players. And the idea of that comparison is just a benchmark. And so what I've got up here is two players, two midfielders, one from the Richmond club and one from the Geelong club. And the idea is that you can see that you can see any aspect of those two players. So you can see the position, you can see their rating, you can see their height, their weight and all the rest. So this provides you with some physical data about those players, but then it goes on to actually look at the performance for things like possessions, contested possessions, uncontested possessions, turnovers and all the rest of it. And then you've got some scoreboard impacts. The key point I want to make here is that every time these two players play against each other, in order to improve their game, they are looking at their own performance relative to the other to try and establish how to improve. And that's exactly what we're doing with farm benchmarking. What we actually do is take out the most profitable or those producers with the highest profit per DSE, dry sheep equivalent, and we try and establish what it is about those businesses that actually differentiates them from the other. And we provide that as a comparison. The other comparator we provide is the average of all the information. And then we put your numbers next to the average of all and next to the highest profit producers, with the aim of you being able to go through line by line and looking at everything you do within your business, so all the costs and all the income, as well as all the production measures, so that you can start to identify what it is that's different about your business relative to those high profit producers. And I'll talk to some of those over the next little while. So what I'll do in this presentation is largely talk to the returns in dollar per DSE terms. So the financial metrics have been presented in dollar per dry sheep equivalent terms. And roughly speaking, there's about one goat or 1.1 goats per dry sheep equivalent, or the reverse actually. There's one goat over an average rangelands herd equals 1.1 DSEs or thereabouts. So when I'm talking DSEs, roughly you can substitute goats for DSEs. It does depend a little on your herd structure, and that's why I put this slide up. This slide just shows how we actually establish the herd average DSE rating. And so we look at the proportion of does or nannies, and then we consider the proportion that are singles and twins. And we've got to do some averaging to do that, because in the rangelands, not everyone, in fact, very few people actually know their weaning percentages. And then we think of how many over the year are likely to be weaners and for what proportion of the year. And then we think of how many are going to be bucks or billies greater than 12 months and for what proportion of the year. So that provides us with a herd structure. Then we make some assumptions about that herd structure that allows us to run the number of DSEs based on your herd numbers. Now, it's important, very important, that you have some idea of your herd numbers. So in opportunistically harvested herds, for example, we make some assumptions about the total herd numbers. So what we do is we take the total numbers sold, and then we ask participants how many they think they run for every animal sold. And typically it's 2 for 1. So for every 1 animal sold, they consider that they're running 2 animals on the place. And then we establish what that means in terms of DSEs, or dry sheep equivalents. Now, the reason we do that is it allows us to compare goat enterprises with a range of other enterprises. And what that allows us to do in multiple enterprise businesses is establish how a goat's performing relative to my other enterprises. And that's some of the data that I'll present shortly. So where does the data come from? Look, we've got data from, majority of the data that we're looking at is primarily goat producers with a focus on meat production. We will take other goat producers, so if you're a dairy producer or a fibre producer, we will take you, but we're focused primarily on the meat side of the business. We've got producers from the medium to high rainfall areas, but the number of data sets that we have there is low relative to the total numbers. So I'm going to talk to that data, but very briefly. In the rangelands, we've further categorised goat enterprises into those that are managed, and managed we're talking really is fenced, I guess. Then we've got unfenced or unmanaged, and we sort of refer to those as opportunistically harvested in this project. And then we've got traded goats in both the rangelands and the medium to high rainfall areas. And typically those traded goats are from businesses that may run a depot in conjunction with their goat enterprise, or it could be that producers that are just trading goats. So they're now wired their place or fenced their place. They've got a number of managed goats, but they're also trading or purchasing in underweight goats and putting those on for weight gain. So that seems to be an increasing enterprise. What we haven't done is segregated those different enterprise types, because the amount of data that we've got at the moment is insufficient to allow us to do that. So we're really encouraging you, if you want to be involved, please become involved and benchmark your business, because the more data that we have, the more easily we can start to look at how the managed herds are going against the opportunistically harvested herds, and how those traded herds are going. I've got a comment here about all of Australia. We are taking goat enterprises from all of Australia. This is just where those data sets have come from so far. The reality is we're open for business. We want to benchmark your goat enterprises. So if you're from Victoria, we're happy to have you. If you're from Western Australia, we're happy to have you. So you've just got to supply us with the information, and we're happy to have you involved. So this is just where the data's fallen. It's not necessarily where we want it. We're happy to have data sets from anywhere. So I just thought I'd quickly run through what we're actually reporting. And so if we look at the top line, we're actually reporting gross profit. And because this is a management accounting system, what we're looking at is sales. We're looking at your purchases, and then we add the inventory change, which is the closing less the opening value. So that gives gross profit. So it's not just sales. We want sales to be adjusted for purchases and inventory change, because what we're trying to establish there is changes in equity as well as income at the gross profit level. From that, we deduct enterprise expenses, and typical enterprise expenses in a goat herd are animal health, sales costs, freight, contract costs, and supplementary feed costs. So gross profit less enterprise expenses gets us to the gross margin level. From that, we deduct overhead expenses, and that includes administration rates, insurance, pasture costs, vehicles, repairs and maintenance, wages. When we talk wages for family businesses, we will allocate a wage to you, so it's an imputed owner-operator wage, and it's important that we include depreciation in there because that is a cost of operating plant equipment, and that's the value over time of loss in value of that equipment. So we include those non-cash items of depreciation and owner wages in the overhead expenses when we're conducting the analysis. And that effectively gets us to the net profit level. So gross profit less enterprise expenses, less overhead expenses gets us to net profit. Now you may ask, well, how do we account in multiple enterprise businesses for the proportion of overheads that should be allocated to the goats? And so what we do is effectively we look at all the DSEs, the total number of DSEs run across the business, and then we take into account the goats as a proportion of the total, and it is that proportion that we assume is the overhead cost that should be apportioned to the goats. So some people may say that they have no costs associated with their opportunistically harvested goats. We don't see it like that. We actually pro rata the overhead costs on the basis of the number of DSEs that those opportunistically harvested goats represent on your farm. Below the line, we don't take into account, which is interest, lease and tax, capital expenditure, and other personal expenses. And the reason we don't is that we're really trying to establish what is the true operating performance of your business, and that's established at the net profit level or the EBIT level, which just stands for earnings before interest and tax. So what's a benchmarking report look like? This is pretty well it. I don't want to go into a lot of detail except just to show you that the first column is basically, as I reported there, sales, purchase and inventory change on a gross level. Then we report it on a per DSE level, and we compare that per DSE level with the third and fourth columns, which are the average of all data and the top 20% ranked on profit per DSE. And then we report all sorts of other things like your gross figures, your livestock trading inventory, the value of that inventory. And then if I go on to the next slide, we report things like your average annual stocking rate, your price received, your cost of production, your production levels per DSE, per hectare and per head sold. And then we present some of it graphically in an attempt to assist you to better understand the information. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that slide, but that is the report that you get. There's no charge for being involved in this project. So if you're interested in being involved, we're very happy to have you involved. And I just will mention that along the bottom right of that slide, there is a scale from red to green, and basically that is just an indicator of room for improvement. So when you go from red to right, if you're ranked down the bottom of the red, it basically means that you've got a high opportunity for improvement. And once you're up the top of the green, the opportunities for improvement are less likely. So that's all we're trying to scale you on there. Okay, so into the information. What we have here is I've just presented the performance of Rangeland's goats, and I have compared it with a range of other enterprises. Now, it's important that I qualify this data because the wool, beef, lamb and dual-purpose sheep data has come from the Holmes Sackett database, and the majority of that data comes from southeastern Australia. It doesn't come from Rangeland's environment. So effectively when I'm comparing goat in the less than 500 millimetre rainfall zone, I'm comparing Rangeland's enterprises with non-Rangeland's performance. And so you've just got to be a bit cautious because the Rangeland's may have had different environmental seasonal conditions over that period from 2016 to 2018. The other interesting thing I think you'll note there is that goat enterprises in the greater than 500 millimetre rainfall zone that I have received to date have performed pretty poorly. Now that may just be a function of that being a very small data set. However, it does actually concur with a project we ran several years ago, which showed that performance in that higher rainfall zone was pretty poor. And I'll talk to that to some extent as well. So the first thing I think to take away from this slide is those goats in the less than 500 mil rainfall zone have achieved net profit levels on average over the 3 years from 2016 to 2018 of around $24 per DSE. That is on par with wool enterprises, which have had a very solid performance over that same period. It is also better than beef enterprises have performed from the higher rainfall zones. They sit just above $20 per DSE in terms of net profit, and it is well above prime lamb enterprises, which over that period sit at about $15 per DSE. Dual purpose sheep just represents typically in our data set is a merino joined to a terminal or maternal sire, and those enterprises have outstripped everything over the last little while. Goats are behind those, but that will be a little different with the 2019 data. So look, goats, very strong performance when you look at it against alternate enterprises, and I think from the people I've spoken to in the rangelands, one of the things that has frustrated them, particularly with beef enterprises, is the issue of suitability of some of that country to beef enterprises relative to goats. And some of them are starting to turn and think that after a few years of taking some pain with beef enterprises, they are ready for a change. So I think it's challenging times ahead for the resource base, because goats are presenting a realistic alternative on the basis of this data to date. Now, as I say, it's not a huge data set, and we'd like more data, but that is the initial results that I have interpreted. So on to the next slide, and this is margin, and I presented this because I think it's interesting. Often we hear about how prices have gone, and clearly this period here, what I've got here is 2012 data, and the reason I've got that is we did a goat cost of production project across Australia back then, and I've taken that data and included it in this data set. We've also got 2016, 17 and 18, which is from this data set, and here I've compared the margin in dollars per kilo carcass weight of beef and lamb, beef being the orange line, lamb being the light blue line, and goat being Rangeland goats being the dark blue line. I have compared all three, and what I'm comparing on the left-hand axis there is margin, and that axis runs from $0 to $4 per kilogram of carcass weight. And what you can see there is that the margins in beef and lamb over that period have been superior relative, in beef and goats rather, have been superior relative to lamb. And if you think about what's happened with lamb prices over that period, they've continued to increase over that time. So it's important that you don't just look at the price side of things and say, well, prices are increasing, that'll mean I'm going to increase my margins. Actually, prices increasing only increases your margin if you retain the margin for yourselves. And what we've seen with the benchmarking data is that a number of lamb producers haven't actually retained the margin for themselves because their costs have gone up at the same rate as have prices. There's a couple of questions here that I will try and deal with as I go along. Do you think the data is going to be showing an average for most? I guess you would have to assume that. Yeah, I'm not sure what that question's getting at, but this is the average. This is the average of all data from rangelands over those individual years. So I probably just need more clarity in that question. Okay. So when you look at cost of production, where does goat meat sit? And this is the average of 3 years now on the left-hand axis, and this is cost of production presented as dollars per kilo dress weight. And I presented beef in dollars per kilo dress weight as well. And what you've got here is you can see that both goat is competitive with beef in terms of cost of production. But you can see that lamb, and this is where I was heading with my preceding slide, lamb has actually increased in terms of its cost of production. So whilst the prices are increasing, so is its cost of production. And so at the moment, what I'm seeing is that goat meat does actually have a competitive advantage over lamb. And that competitive advantage is that it costs less to produce each kilo of that product. Okay, so I've just got clarity on that question. Average of all others, the ones that aren't benchmarked. Yeah, look, so thanks for the comment. I think the point you're making is, can I assume that this data is representative of all data across goat enterprises? No, there's no way I can assume that. All I can do is let you know that it is some indication of where the industry is. Typically what we would see, particularly with our broader benchmarking data, is that the people who are prepared to benchmark typically have higher returns relative to the broader community. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, so when we take that to the next level, I guess what we've got here is return on assets managed, and return on assets managed is a measure of profit relative to the total value of assets under management. And the way we established the total value of assets under management was we asked people for their key asset, which is land. We asked them to value on a comparable sales basis their land, and then we value their livestock and their equipment as well. And then we pro-rata that based on the number of DSEs they run, and their profit per DSE divided by their total assets under management per DSE gives us a return on assets managed. So the reason we use this ratio is that it's a measure of financial resource efficiency. So we consider it's better than profit in terms of resource efficiency, because profit's an absolute dollar figure. This, as a measure of financial efficiency, measures profit relative to the total value of all the assets which are tied up to generate that profit. And what we've seen here is some pretty solid operating returns from goat enterprises. So this is the orange line represents the average over the 3-year period benchmarked for all Rangeland's goat enterprises, and that sits at 5.8%. And then you can see the volatility between years. And that volatility between years is typical of nearly any area. Obviously in the rangelands, it can be more volatile. And I think what we'll see is 2019, unfortunately, heading south again from the 2018 figures. So what we've got is 2016 at a bit below 5.8%, 2017, which was a higher rainfall year. I think the average rainfall relative to the long-term average was about 110%. So meaning that we received 10% more than the long-term average. giving, and clearly that didn't happen in every location, that's an average over all the data, giving a return of about 9% in that year, and then that has come back year on year back to about 3% operating return for that area. So some pretty exceptional returns for goat businesses, and that is the average of all data. So the average of the best supersedes that again significantly, and I'll present that data shortly. So how do the best compare with the rest? So in this case, what I've done is I've actually split the cohorts. So we're no longer looking at the average data. What I've done is I've taken those producers who have 3 years of data and consistently generate high profits. I've taken those high profits per DSE. I've taken the small cohort of the highest profit producers, and then I've looked at them separately to the rest of the data set. And this is the outcome. So what you see here is on a dollar per DSE basis, the high profit producers, in terms of income or gross profit, which is income adjusted for purchases and inventory change, over that 3-year period have generated close to $70 worth of gross profit per DSE, whilst the rest of the data set have generated about closer to $50 per DSE in gross profit. Then if you have a look at the enterprise expenses, one of the interesting things here is that some of those highest profit producers actually have a higher cost per DSE at the enterprise level, sitting at about $5 per DSE relative to the rest. And some of that high cost has come from supplementary feed. So there are people that are supplementary feeding Rangeland's goats, but the majority of it has actually come from increased sales costs and freight costs relative to the rest, which just means they're possibly more remote or further from works than some of the others. Then if you get onto the overhead costs, what you see is that cost base coming back to about $20 per DSE, and this is where you start to see some difference in the cost base, because for the rest of those producers, they're sitting at about $32 per DSE. So what you're starting to see is a significant increase in cost of the rest, with a significant reduction in income. And at the profit level, what that means is there's a doubling of profit for the highest profit producers relative to the rest. Now, this isn't unique to goat enterprises. This is pretty typical of nearly all livestock enterprises that we see across wool, beef, and lamb, and dual purpose and trading enterprises as well. So you do tend to see some of these things. So I'll talk shortly to some of the differences that are outputs of the data to date. So this is the way I'm interpreting what the highest profit rangeland goat producers do differently relative to the rest. So the way to interpret this graph is along the left-hand axis of this graph is a number of key performance indicators. Along the bottom axis is a percentage, and the extent to which the blue line deviates from the 0 point just shows how much better or how different the highest profit producers were relative to the rest. So the way I'll just talk you through these line by line. So if we start with cost of production in dollars per kilo carcass weight, what you can see is that the highest profit producers were 30% lower than the average, because they're deviating negatively from that 0 point by about 30%. They had a cost of production of $2.72. I think it was compared to about $4 for the rest. the average of those, of all data, sat at about $3.50 or thereabouts. So what that suggests to me is that it is achievable to produce a kilo of rangeland goat meat for $2.70 or thereabouts. The price received was slightly higher for this cohort relative to the rest at $5.81. And it is possible, typically we don't see much deviation in price, but it's possible that some of these producers have relationships with processors that allows them a higher price. That is, they may be delivering to suit the processor rather than to suit themselves, and they may receive a higher price on that basis. Or it could be that they have fewer goats that are actually out of spec and therefore not discounted at the same to the same extent. The next line is production, and it's measured in kilograms of carcass weight per head sold, and it deviates from the average only by about 5%. So per head sold, these producers have slightly higher animal weights, and when you look at that per DSE, which is the next one down, they actually had about 10% higher carcass weight per DSE. Now, some of that might come from herd structure. What I mean by that is that it is possible that they're getting livestock off earlier, so younger weight animals off earlier, which would actually lead to higher carcass weights per DSE. So that's a sort of herd structure type issue. Interestingly, they have smaller scale, so the highest profit producers, there is a fair range in there, but on average they have smaller scale relative to the rest of the producers, and their scale sits at about 7,300 relative to the rest of those goat producers in that rangelands cohort. When you look at gross profit per labour unit, so what this is assessing is the amount of income adjusted for purchases and inventory change for every labour unit on farm. And what this is suggesting is that the highest profit goat producers in the rangelands, for every labour unit on farm, are generating $729,000 worth of gross profit, or that sort of top line. And that's 1.5 or 1.3 times higher than the amount of gross profit per labour unit generated by the rest. This is leading to one of the biggest issues in differentiating the high profit rangelands goat producers from the rest, and that is labour efficiency. It's also delivered in the next line, which is labour efficiency. That DSE/LU just stands for DSEs per labour unit, effectively the number of goats, if you like, for every full-time equivalent labour unit. And what you can see there is that the highest profit goat producers in the rangelands basically have labour efficiency that is 65% higher relative to the rest, and their labour efficiency sits at about 12,000 DSE or thereabouts per labour unit. And in terms of the way we measure that labour efficiency, we actually ask you as a benchmarker where your time goes. Operationally, the reality is operations, direct handling operations and so on, represent a very small proportion of the total time that it takes to manage a goat business. A fair bit of the rest of the time goes into things like managing waters, repairs and maintenance and those types of things. And we've effectively prorated that in multiple enterprise businesses. So if you run an opportunistically harvested herd, that will be a fair proportion of your time that is actually allocated to that herd. So things like grading roads and keeping things upgraded, they will all be overhead labour that is allocated to a goat enterprise to some extent. And when you look at return on assets managed, the highest profit rangelands goat producers achieve about 8%, which is 65% higher than the rest. Okay, so we've been through most of these figures. What are the differences? Well, the best rangelands sit on $2.72 cost of production. The others sit at around $4. Price received, as I said, there was a marginal increase in price received, and I've talked to that. Talked to production per DSE, marginal differences, sale weight per animal, and labour efficiency being a big difference. And that's mainly driving a difference in cost structure. So I just wanted to tease out that labour efficiency line because it really is a big issue in rangelands enterprises. And the title of this slide is Labour Efficiency in Goats Drives a Low Cost Structure. What I wanted to show is that the labour costs per DSE, there's two components of labour in our view, and the first is the direct labour costs, which we allocate to you. That is, you know, even if you don't pay yourself a salary, we consider that there's an opportunity cost to you being in the business, so we will allocate you a salary that is non-discretionary if you're a family labour unit, and that is allocated around the cost of around $70,000 for the first labour unit and $60,000 thereafter, which is slightly lower, incidentally, than other benchmarking services. So the labour cost there, what you see is the high profit producers, dollar per DSE labour cost is $6.30 per DSE. When you have a look at the rest, it's more than double. So anything you can do that focuses on that labour cost is really important. So the other component of labour costs is labour-related costs. And when I'm talking labour-related costs, I'm really talking about as soon as you've got a labour unit, you'll need vehicles, you'll need motorbikes, you'll need fuel, you'll have more depreciation and those sorts of things. Sorry, I've just got a question which I'll answer on the go. The point being made is that this table would lead you to believe that price is more important than kilograms turn off, which I thought would actually be the opposite. If the price wasn't so high, do you think these would be around the other way? Look, I'm going to answer that by saying it is actually kilos turn off that is driving that rather than the price. I think what we would see, I think it's a fair point in that part of the increased income is driven by price, I think is the point being made, and the other part is being driven by kilos. Given largely that the price is out of your control to some extent, other than underweights and meeting market specs, which I think can be managed, I would focus on kilograms, which is probably going to come down to either genetics or the way that you manage the herd. The other thing I didn't mention up front is I am not an expert in the operational side or the technical side of goat management. I guess where my expertise has been called on is really at understanding the numbers and dragging the conclusions from other enterprises. So there could be something more to the price than what I'm actually realising, but I think if you think about other enterprises, typically what you see is that in commodity production, which is effectively what goat meat production is, you accept that you're a commodity producer and you try and produce each kilo of meat in as efficient way as possible. So I think there's another way of me answering the question or the point that you've made, and that is probably to go back to cost of production. And when you look at cost of production, if we go back to that preceding slide, if we look at cost of production, you can see that the cost of production is $2.72 for the best relative to $4. Now that's independent of price. So it's actually, it's typically the area which we try and encourage people to work on is driving a low cost of production. And that comes from two parts. One is a sensible cost structure, but the other part is having plenty of production. And I think that's what those best rangelands producers have done there. So yes, they get a kick from additional price received as well, but have a look at the difference in price received there. The difference is about 40 cents per kilo. Now have a look at the difference in cost of production. It's about $1.30 per kilo. So it's really that cost of production which is actually driving the efficiency. Quickly, just to continue on with this slide, the gross profit per labour unit, that just sort of carries on from that labour efficiency. So you can see the difference in labour efficiency of the high profit producers, which is 12,000 DSEs versus 7,000. Now, I'll present another slide which talks to scale being important in achieving that, but I'm also going to talk to one outlying data set where I think there's some interesting stuff coming out of the technology space and so on, which actually might lead to labour efficiencies in this rangelands area. Gross profit per labour unit sits there at about $729,000 per labour unit in the high profit cohort relative to the rest of 310,000. And again, just really, I guess, stressing the importance. There's two components there. One is of driving plenty of production, but the second part is doing it from a really efficient labour base, and that's what that talks to. So the labour efficiency, or the amount of income generated from each labour unit in the high profit cohort, is far higher relative to the rest. There's a few more questions here, which I hope is okay if I just deal with them as I go. Great context and framing for the commercial basis. As producers, we'd like to compare our operational performance measures, such as kitting percentage, average weight unit sold, average age of units sold. Did your data manage to establish these? That's a really good question. Thanks for the question. Look, I tried to get kitting percentage. I did get average weight of the unit sold, and average age of unit sold, no, I didn't get, because the problem I've got, and it's one of the recommendations that I'll put to you by the end of this presentation, is that the data being kept on farm is not adequate at the moment to capture those things. So I was lucky to get what I got, let alone trying to focus on the things that I think that you quite rightly point out there are highly important. But I've got to get what I can in the first instance. So I think as we go along and people start to see the value of some of this data, they might actually start to value some of the things that you've sort of alluded to there, which is kitting percentage, average weight of animals sold, which we do have, and then average age of units sold, which we don't have. Because effectively what seems to be happening at the moment is we're drafting everything, it goes off farm, we get a count of what goes out, and then we get a total weight back in. We don't even really, in many cases, get it sexed, and we certainly don't get it aged. But do I think that would add value? Yes, I certainly do. So thanks for your feedback on those questions as well, because it does actually provide me as a presenter with some clear direction and idea that you're actually listening to me, which is nice. Okay, so I just thought, given that labour efficiency is quite a big part of this rangelands business, and achieving high levels of labour efficiency is important. I haven't dug right into the detail, but I just thought I dragged this out this morning to try and establish whether there was some sort of correlation between scale and labour efficiency. And according to this data, there is, but I'm going to talk to an outlying data set as well. So what I'm talking to here, along the left-hand axis of this slide, is the percentage of benchmarked rangelands goat enterprises running from 0 to 30%. And along the bottom, all I've done is sort of broken the cohorts into labour efficiency cohorts, if you like. So the first blue bar represents those enterprises that have less than 5,000 DSEs per labour unit. Forget about the number at the top at the moment. I'm just going to talk to the data. The next is 5,000 to 7,500 DSEs per labour unit, or goats per labour unit effectively. The next is 7,500 to 10,000. The next is 10 to 15,000, and the next is greater than 15,000. Now, the first thing I jump to from this slide is, firstly, there are people achieving labour efficiency targets or labour efficiency of greater than 15,000 DSEs per labour unit. That's what this right-hand most blue column indicates. It's only a small proportion of the total benchmarked goat enterprises. I accept that, but there are people doing it. Unfortunately, there's a lot more at over 25% doing less than 5,000 DSEs per labour unit. The figure above the blue line is actually the average herd number of each of those cohorts in terms of DSEs managed. So what we are seeing is a bit of a correlation there. As you have higher numbers of DSE managed, you do actually achieve those higher levels of labour efficiency. However, so whilst that appears to be the case, I'm going to talk to one producer who has a number of DSEs under management of only about 1,500 or thereabouts. He's managing off-site and he's achieving levels of labour efficiency of about well over 15,000 DSEs per labour unit. And the way that labour efficiency in the rangelands environment, so the way that labour efficiency is actually being achieved is largely through remote monitoring technology. And so he's effectively dropped out, or he and she have effectively dropped out the need to monitor waters on farm because they do that remotely off farm. So it's a great example, in my view, of technology coming to the fore and actually dropping labour efficiency. Now, sure, you had to invest in that and there was a upfront cost, but that upfront cost in the infrastructure and technology is offsetting the cost of labour annually. And sure, you can't do it at any cost, but in that case, it was just a neat little example of how some of those technologies are actually paying. Now, there may be cases where there's still a need for having someone on farm and all the rest of it, and I think there is someone that checks certain things on an ad hoc basis, but certainly it's that person with a low number of goats under management is still achieving a high level of labour efficiency. So the point I wanted to make there is low scale is not does not preclude you from achieving high levels of labour efficiency, but yes, you probably will need to invest to get it. The other thing I think is that's not well mapped out in here is things like, you know, the use of gyros versus ground, and then, you know, obviously there may be things like country versus open country may actually prevent you from achieving some of those high levels of labour efficiency. So I accept that there'll be a lot of variation, specifically just on the resources that you manage, and that hasn't necessarily been well captured in this data today. But I do think we need to invest heavily there because in exploring that further, because I really see that as a big opportunity. Okay, look, this slide doesn't say much other than what we've got here on the left-hand axis is sales. So what I've mapped here for the 2017 and 18 year are sales of animals relative to the 2016 year, and I really think this is just talking to probably the level of seasonality and fecundity of the goat herd in the rangelands. So what you're seeing is basically this is an index, and all it's showing is that 2017 there was 20% or 23% more goats sold in the 2017 year relative to the 2016 year. And then back in the 2018 year, we were back to 2016 levels. And I think really what this is talking to is the fact that the effects of the dry are probably going to be seen in the 2019 year and haven't yet been seen in the in the numbers to date, other than inventory values are lower as a result of having fewer animals on hand. And that's reflected in this graph. So this is the percent change in numbers between years from opening to closing. There was in 2016 there was an increase by about 12%. In 2017, from opening to closing, there was an increase of about 25%, and then that has been reversed in 2018, which really just sort of talks to the seasons that have been experienced more than anything else. There's another question: how many DSE is a 35 kilo live weight goat? Thanks for the question. Look, I put up a slide earlier on which actually talked to the DSE ratings. It really depends on whether that goat, what stage of nutritional requirement that goat is, or what stage of reproduction. So whether it's a male goat or a female goat, the age of the goat, the weight of the goat, and whether it's a young goat or an old goat. So I don't think I'll dwell on that too much further, but thanks for the question. There are some DSE ratings that MLA have, and at the moment I'm in the throes of writing a situation analysis, and in that situation analysis I've referred to some DSE tables which are available on the web. So this is the other part of what we've benchmarked, and this is land value per DSE. So what we've seen over the years is an increase in land value or wealth from asset ownership. This is sort of an interesting aside, I guess. This is, for those of you that are landowners, this is effectively the non-operational part of your business, and it generates a lot of wealth or creates a lot of wealth from you through capital appreciation. And what this slide is representing on the left-hand axis is land value expressed in dollars per DSE, running from $0 to $600. And what we've got is the years along the bottom axis. And all I've done there is I've got the Rangelands goat data, which has been captured from this exercise, running from $350 per DSE up to $500 per DSE in 2018. And that is reflective of some of the industry data I've seen from CBRE and Colliers and others, Ray White and others in the space that actually have valuation processes. And what we see, I've compared it with the Holmes Sackett data because we do a similar thing in our own benchmarking, and it tracks fairly closely. Now, you could argue that numbers are down in 2018, so that has slightly inflated land values because those land values are managed per, are expressed in per DSE managed. However, it looks to track fairly well close to that Holmes Sackett data. Now, the important thing to think about here is your investment in the business. And so for every DSE managed on your farm, you've got invested $500 at the moment, or could even be higher in 2019, as appreciation does appear to be continuing. You've also got about $100 per DSE in the livestock that run on there, and probably about $50 per DSE invested in plant and equipment. And so for every DSE that you operate, you've got about $650 per DSE based on 2018 numbers invested on farm. So it's pretty easy to work out from that what sort of returns you can expect from goat enterprises if you know your profit. So I think on the basis of sort of average profits of about, I think we said $24, and I'll present some numbers shortly which will give you an idea. $24 divided by 650 gives you a return of $3.6% operating return. But I'll talk to this in the next slide, I think, a bit further. So the next slide, really, I guess what I wanted to establish is some benchmarks for best goat profits and profitability, incidentally. And so really, those best goat producers, you could split them down the middle, and there were a number of them that were actually exceeding $70 per DSE in income or gross profit, and that was at an average price of around $5.50 per kilo. Think of where the prices are now, carcass weight, and they're sitting at about, let's call it an average of $9 per kilo carcass weight. Then, you know, that increases to $115 per DSE. Now, the important thing from this is to think about retaining the margin for you, which means you can't increase cost if you want to retain that margin for you. And the next benchmark for best goat profits is to achieve a carcass weight on average of about 16.6 kilos per head sold across all animals sold. The next target I've got there is to exceed a labour efficiency level of 12,000 DSEs per labour unit. And then the next benchmark I've got is to have total operating costs for your business below $25 per DSE. Now, if you don't know where you're at, I'd strongly encourage you to get involved in this benchmarking project, because the reality is we will tell you how you're going. And the aim is not to denigrate you if you're not doing well, it's just to be able to identify where the opportunities are for improvement. In fact, if you're not doing well, I think it actually smacks of opportunity, because it means the lowest hanging fruit is still available. The lowest cost gains are still available within your business. Those who are really performing or performing well have probably got those lowest cost gains, and it's going to be harder to produce to get every incremental gain from that point. If you achieve those benchmarks, even at a price of $5.50 per kilo, what you'll be up for is about $40 worth of profit per DSE. And if we divide that by that $650 worth of land capital, livestock capital, and plant and equipment capital, that generates you about a 6% return on assets managed, which is over the long term pretty impressive. At current prices, if you were to achieve $115 per DSE in gross income, and you can do that from a cost base of $25, then that's when you really start to get excited about where the opportunities are in this sort of business, because that's when we get to $90 per DSE worth of profit. Divide that by our $650 worth of land, livestock, and plant equipment capital, and where you end up is a 13.8% return. So it's pretty exciting times. I'm not suggesting that you rely on that high price. What I'm saying is make sure you do everything within your favour, within your power, to drive a low cost of production, which will mean that you don't need a high price to generate reasonable returns. Okay, so where are the opportunities that I see? I think the first one is you really need to know your livestock numbers. From what I've seen in this project so far, there's still a lot of guesswork out there about what sort of numbers people are running. And I think you really, when you've got those animals in the yards, try and tally your billies, does, nannies, kids and weaners. And I understand that that will actually drag your labour efficiency back, but I do think if you can somehow monitor that, there will be value in that in the future. I think genetics is potentially an opportunity for the future, and I know a lot of people are investing there. I can't actually tell you whether the level of returns there for your level of investment are being made from this data. That's not to say someone else can't. But know your weight gain data. You know, even if you just take a cohort of or somehow monitor a small number, then at least you'll have some way. Now, there may be a more efficient way to do that remotely. I'm hoping that this is where the technology space becomes our friend. Finally, I think the opportunities really are in labour efficiency. Anything that you can sensibly do at a reasonable cost to replace labour with infrastructure, you should be considering looking at investing in. Okay, so look, finally I've got a plug. Basically, this is the project that we're involved with MLA. We really do value your input into this, because the more data we get, the more we can explore the intricacies of that data and come out with clear recommendations. So if you're willing to contribute 5 years worth of data and you've got reasonable records, and you know your goat numbers, please get in contact with us. And I think that's me. So it's probably back over to you, Courtney, as the moderator, to take any questions from this point. I have tried to answer a few as I go on, and I know I'm past the hour limit. So thanks everyone for your attendance. If you've got to go, I appreciate that, but I'll try and answer questions if there are any.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. That was very informative, and yeah, you have answered almost all the questions, but I do have one, which I'm just wondering, you talk about labour efficiency as being important, and have you noticed any trends in whether those more efficient businesses are managed herds or if they're unfenced herds?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think in that high profit cohort, there's actually a mix. So there is and knowing that high profit cohort had high levels of labour efficiency, there was actually one producer who's got a reasonable scale, totally fenced business. There was a producer who fenced midway between, so he had opportunistically harvested goats and managed goats, and then there was another one like that, and then there was another one that was purely opportunistically harvested. But even things like trap yards, for example, if they're practical, may actually lead to higher levels of labour efficiency, but I don't have enough data to really tease that out at the moment. So I can't answer your question with any confidence. I'm sorry, Courtney.
That's fine. Thanks for that. Steve?
I've got a question there, which is, if you're just starting out, can we still join the benchmarking? Look, you can. Yes, you can. It's just that depending on when you start, the number of years of data will be shorter. But yes, we're not opposed to taking on people that are midway through their journey on running or managing goats. So we'd be happy to speak to you. Feel free to give us a call, and we're happy to chat about how you might actually become involved in the project.
Great, thanks, John. I think unless anybody has any other questions that they'd like to send through, we might call it there. As you exit the webinar, could you please just fill out that survey that will pop up on your screen? That's really important to our webinar series because it allows us to make improvements and make sure that those topics are targeting what you as an industry want to hear. And then I'd also just like to mention that the next webinar is planned for Thursday the 19th, which is next week. The topic is what, where and when the use of nitrogen in pastures, which is one part of a two-part presentation by Richard Eckard from the University of Melbourne. The second part of Richard's presentation would be the following Wednesday on the 25th of September, and you will receive an email with more details on those upcoming webinars, so I hope you can join us for those. Yeah, so thanks everyone for tuning in today, and thank you to John. That was a very informative presentation. So, thank you everyone.
Thanks for attending everyone. Bye-bye.